Okay, so, for all you listeners out there, I think it's safe to say we share that deep fascination with the questions that really get to the heart of things, right? Those fundamental puzzles that have captivated thinkers for centuries.
Absolutely. Those big, enduring questions that just keep calling us back for more, no matter how much we explore them.
Exactly. And while knowing your philosophical inclinations, your constant pursuit of understanding the very bedrock of our thought, we thought, what better way to kick off this deep dive than by tackling the historical relationship between religion and morality? I mean, talk about foundational concepts.
Two powerful forces that have shaped the trajectory of Western thought for millennia, no doubt.
Right. And to guide our exploration, we're turning to a truly comprehensive resource, a real treasure trove of philosophical insight. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, well, religion and morality in Western philosophy. I mean, the title pretty much says it all, doesn't it? But our aim here isn't just to offer a dry chronological
Oh,
survey.
certainly not.
Yeah, we're going to dig deeper. We want to uncover some of those hidden connections, those surprising insights into how these two domains have been intertwined across, well, really across centuries of philosophical inquiry. And, for someone with your philosophical background, I think you'll agree, this is a journey that promises to be anything but boring.
I wholeheartedly agree. And as we navigate this intricate historical terrain, I think it's worth establishing a sort of, well, pragmatic equivalence, let's say, between the terms morality and ethics.
Okay, interesting, because I know, right, the philosophical literature is, well, it's absolutely brimming with attempts to draw those sharp distinctions. Think about Kant's deontology versus, say, Aristotelian virtue ethics.
Precisely. But if we delve deeper, beneath the surface of those theoretical elaborations and consider their etymological roots, an interesting convergence emerges.
Ah, back to the origins.
Moral, stemming from the Latin mos, and ethics, from the Greek ethos, both point us towards the customs, the habits, those ingrained patterns of behavior, really, that shape our understanding of how we are to live a good human life.
So, at their core, they're really getting at the same fundamental question: how should we live?
Precisely.
Now, let's talk about religion. I mean, even among us philosophers, right, that term can spark some lively debates.
It's a word laden with historical baggage, no doubt.
And its origins, if we trace them back, likely reside in the Latin religare, to bind back.
A binding back.
Interesting. Yeah, and while the concept of religion has certainly evolved, right, it's expanded to encompass non-theistic systems of thought and practice as well. Within the Western tradition, it generally signifies a framework, if you will, of beliefs and practices centered on a binding relationship with a divinity or divinities.
Right, a sense of connection, of obligation, perhaps even of dependence on a higher power.
Yeah, but even a cursory glance at the history of Western thought reveals a truly astonishing diversity in how those divinities have been conceived. And of course, how that human-divine relationship is understood, that's where things get really interesting, I think.
It's a vast and ever-shifting landscape, that's for sure. Think about the ancient Greeks, for instance.
Okay, the Greeks, yeah.
Their pantheon was teeming with anthropomorphic gods and goddesses.
Right, those very human-like deities with all their flaws and their dramas.
But it wasn't just gods and goddesses.
No.
Think about the spirits, the heroes, even individuals elevated to divine status.
Oh, right.
And within this already diverse landscape, you have those enigmatic figures like Socrates
Okay, Socrates.
with his daimonion, that inner voice guiding his actions, almost like a personal divine counsel.
Right, that mysterious voice that always seemed to steer him away from potential missteps.
And the widespread practice of ancestor veneration, blurring the line between the human and the divine.
Okay, yeah. Ancestor veneration, that makes sense.
So given this expansive and multifaceted nature of religion, perhaps Wittgenstein's notion of religion as a kind of family resemblance concept, offers a particularly useful lens for our philosophical deep dive.
Okay, family resemblance. Remind me how that works again.
It suggests a network of overlapping features
Okay.
where various religious expressions share certain similarities,
Right.
but without necessarily possessing a single, universally applicable set of, defining criteria.
Gotcha. So there's no one-size-fits-all definition, but rather a sort of a web of interconnected characteristics.
Right.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's embark on this historical journey. Our exploration, as you mentioned, will proceed largely chronologically, and I think what will immediately become apparent, particularly to those of you with a philosophical eye, is this. For the vast majority of Western intellectual history, morality and religion were, well, they weren't just, neighbors. They were deeply intertwined, often inseparably so.
Yes, they were often seen as two sides of the same coin.
Right. So let's start our exploration in ancient Greece. I mean, what better place to begin our inquiry into the Western mind than the cradle of Western civilization itself?
A fertile ground for philosophical investigation.
And I think a good starting point might be, well, Homer.
Homer, yes.
I mean, his epics, they weren't just stories, right? They served as those foundational narratives shaping the cultural and even the moral landscape for centuries.
Absolutely foundational.
And his gods and goddesses, they're immortal, they wield immense power, but there's also something strikingly familiar about them, isn't there?
Right, that anthropomorphism. They're driven by passions.
Oh, yeah.
Honor, glory, revenge. Much like the heroes in his tales, just, well, on a grander scale.
Yeah.
But here's a crucial insight, I think, for our philosophical sense.
Okay, I'm listening.
There's this fascinating honor loop at play.
An honor loop.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to elaborate on that.
So each of these divinities, they possess specific domains, honors, if you will.
Right.
Poseidon's dominion over the seas, for instance.
Okay, right, yeah.
And in return for their divine favor, right, their intervention in human affairs, humans offer them honor through, ritual acts of worship.
So it's a kind of give and take, right? A reciprocal arrangement.
Exactly. It's a system of reciprocal obligation. We see it in the construction of temples, the performance of sacrifices, the recitation of hymns. The gods, they derive sustenance, even pleasure, from this honor.
It's almost like a cosmic economy of sorts.
In a way, yes. And in return, they're expected to assist mortals,
Right.
particularly within their designated spheres of influence. It echoes those client-patron relationships so prevalent in the aristocratic society that Homer's poems likely reflect.
Makes sense. But here's a critical philosophical point, wouldn't you say?
Yes, indeed.
Even these seemingly all-powerful gods, they weren't entirely unbound.
Right.
They were themselves accountable to a higher order, whether conceived as fate, Moira, or Justice Stykio.
Right. And we see a vivid illustration of this in the Iliad, don't we?
When Zeus himself is constrained, unable to save his beloved Hector.
Even Zeus, the king of the gods, is bound by this higher order.
Suggesting that even the divine operates within a moral or a cosmic framework.
It's a fascinating constraint on divine power.
Now, fast forward a bit,
Mhm.
we encounter the pre-Socratics, and a common narrative, right, in the history of philosophy, is that they represent this decisive departure, turning away from religious explanations toward, the nascent field of scientific inquiry.
A shift in focus, certainly.
But is that really an accurate portrayal of their relationship with the divine and with morality?
There's a degree of truth to that traditional account, I'd say.
Okay.
When thinkers like Thales propose water as this fundamental substance, or Anaximenes posits air, or Heraclitus identifies fire, ever-changing fire, as that underlying principle of reality, they are indeed moving away from those mythological explanations, rooted in the intentional actions of those quasi-human deities.
So it's a shift from those narratives involving, those divine interventions and caprices to seeking those impersonal material principles.
Yes, a movement towards abstraction.
But it's not quite a clean break, is it?
Not entirely, no. They didn't completely abandon the concept of the divine.
Okay.
Heraclitus, always a source of philosophical intrigue, right?
Oh, yeah. Enigmatic, to say the least.
He famously stated that wisdom, Sophia,
Right.
both consents and does not consent to be called Zeus.
Oh, okay. I always found that one a bit puzzling.
It suggests an acknowledgement of this divine dimension to this underlying principle, this Sophia, this wisdom,
Okay.
while simultaneously rejecting those overly anthropomorphic attributes of the conventional Olympian gods.
Right. So it's not so much rejecting the divine as reconceptualizing it.
Precisely. And he goes on to link this divine law, the ios nomos.
Right, to human law, anthropos nomos, implying a foundational connection between the two.
Interesting.
Though he wasn't exactly, optimistic about the capacity of the masses to formulate truly just laws.
Well, some things never change, I guess.
Perhaps.
Okay, so moving on to the sophists, those masters of rhetoric, they're often characterized as moral relativists, undermining any kind of fixed moral or religious foundations.
They were certainly skilled at deconstructing conventional wisdom.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, their mastery of rhetoric allowed them to to argue persuasively, for multiple and often contradictory viewpoints on, well, on pretty much any given issue.
And this was a highly valued skill in Athenian democracy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it enabled them to sway those, those assemblies to influence legal and political outcomes.
Yes.
And Protagoras' famous dictum,
Man is the measure of all things. Right. Taken at face value, it certainly seems to undermine any kind of objective standard, whether divine or otherwise. But philosophically speaking, I think there's more to it than that, wouldn't you say?
I think so, yes.
Because even Plato, in his dialogues, he depicts Protagoras as recounting this myth where the gods bestow upon humanity shame,
Right.
edassa, and justice specifically to enable the formation of civilized societies.
So even within this seemingly relativistic framework, there's a suggestion of a divine origin for those capacities that underpin social order.
Interesting.
And even Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, who famously argues that justice is, well, merely the interest of the stronger.
Right. Might makes right, as the saying goes.
He still believed that this principle operated at both the human and implicitly the divine level, even if his understanding of what constituted that interest was, well, radically different from those Platonic ideals.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that even in the hands of the sophists, this connection between the divine and morality, it doesn't completely disappear. It morphs. It takes on different forms.
It becomes more fluid, more open to interpretation and manipulation, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, let's turn to Socrates, the philosophical gadfly of Athens.
A pivotal figure, no doubt.
His trial and execution, of course, they're legendary.
A tragic end for such a brilliant mind.
So where did his philosophical inquiries, his relentless questioning, position him within this evolving relationship between religion and morality?
Socrates is a particularly fascinating figure for our philosophical inquiry, I think.
Right.
His famous dialogues, especially his exchange with Euthyphro, directly confront this very question.
Oh, yes, the Euthyphro dilemma.
The nature of piety, a key aspect of ancient Greek religion and morality.
Right.
Euthyphro, he presents himself as this expert on religious matters.
Okay.
And he's prosecuting his own father for murder.
What?
Justifying his action by referencing similar tales of divine retribution in those traditional religious narratives.
So he's appealing to precedent, basically.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
But Socrates vehemently rejects these stories.
He does.
He argues that the gods, by their very nature, cannot be the source of immoral actions.
So he's setting up this higher standard for divine conduct, wouldn't you say?
A standard rooted in reason, the conception of the gods as inherently good and wise. And I think it's crucial to remember here that
Right.
Socrates was not, despite the charges leveled against him, an atheist.
Right. That's a common misconception.
He actively participated in the religious life of Athens.
Okay.
He defends himself at his trial by claiming belief in divinities.
Including, of course, his own daimonium.
Precisely. He interprets his relentless questioning, his pursuit of wisdom, as this sacred duty, a service to Apollo in response to that famous pronouncement of the Delphic Oracle.
So for Socrates, philosophy itself was a kind of religious calling.
In a way, yes.
And then there's that dilemma he poses to Euthyphro, right?
The Euthyphro dilemma.
It continues to resonate, doesn't it, within ethical and theological debates?
It cuts to the core of the relationship between morality and the divine.
Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods?
A question that has haunted philosophers and theologians for centuries.
And Socrates, of course, he favors the former.
He argues that piety, like those other virtues, possesses an inherent quality that makes it worthy of divine approval.
So it's not just a matter of divine whim, right? The gods love what is good because it is good.
Precisely. They recognize and value what is intrinsically good, what is pious.
Yeah.
And there are even subtle hints in his dialogues that suggest, well, that living a virtuous life, doing good, is in some way, pleasing to the gods or serves them in some way.
Interesting.
Implying this connection between human morality and divine favor that goes beyond mere arbitrary command.
Okay, so now let's turn to Plato, Socrates' most famous student. I mean, he painstakingly documented his teacher's inquiries, those thought-provoking dialogues.
Dialogues that continue to challenge us even today.
So how did Plato build upon those foundations in exploring this connection between the divine and the moral?
It's crucial to remember that we shouldn't treat Plato's dialogues as, as this monolithic, unchanging system.
Okay, right. It's a body of work that evolves over time.
But there is this recurring motif, this idea of striving for assimilation to the divine, conceived as perfectly just and good.
So we should strive to become like God.
In a way, yes. It's this aspiration toward a higher state of being.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this articulated explicitly in dialogues like the Theaetetus, where becoming like God as much as possible is presented as this ultimate moral aim.
Interesting.
And this aspiration, it's deeply intertwined with his belief in the immortality of the soul.
Right, the soul's journey back to the realm of the forms.
By cultivating those rational and immortal aspects of our being, we move closer to that divine realm.
And of course, his doctrine of the forms, that's central to this understanding, right?
Absolutely central.
The form of the good, that ultimate transcendent reality situated on the other side of being,
Right.
the source of all intelligibility and value, it illuminates all those other forms.
Justice.
Beauty.
Precisely. And in the Laws, his later work, Plato's Athenian character explicitly states that the god is the ultimate measure of all things.
Okay.
And those who seek to befriend this divine measure, they should strive to embody those godlike qualities.
So there's a real sense of striving, of reaching for something higher. And what about that magnet analogy from the ion?
Ah, yes. In the Ion, Plato employs this powerful analogy.
Okay.
Divine goodness. It acts as this attractive force, drawing us toward it like a magnet drawing iron filings.
So we're naturally drawn to the good.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And what about Aristotle, Plato's student for, 2 decades at the Academy? He's often characterized as taking a more empirical, a less metaphysically driven approach to philosophy.
He was certainly more grounded in the observation of the natural world.
So how did he navigate this relationship between the divine and morality?
It's fascinating to know that in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that work dedicated to understanding human flourishing, eudaimonia, the terms God, theos, and divine, the eresion, they appear with surprising frequency, almost as often as happiness, eudaimonia, and happy eudaimon.
Really? So the divine wasn't just some afterthought for him?
Not at all. In his Eudemian Ethics, he explicitly states that the ultimate goal of human life is service to and contemplation of God.
Wow.
He even argues that God doesn't engage in contemplation of the human realm to avoid a diminution of his own perfection.
Okay, that's a new one.
And echoing Plato, he posits that the well-being of the polis, the city-state, holds a theological priority over the flourishing of the individual.
So the common good trumps individual happiness.
In a way, yes. It's about recognizing that we are inherently social creatures, that our individual flourishing is bound up with the health of the community as a whole.
Okay, interesting. And he also outlined a kind of hierarchy of those normative states of human life, as I recall.
Yes, he outlines 6 distinct normative states with the divine occupying the apex, even surpassing the highest forms of human virtue.
So even our best efforts fall short of the divine.
Blessedness, makarios, the highest form of happiness attainable by humans, that's something we honor, in a manner akin to the gods. But mere human virtue, that's merely commended.
Okay, a subtle but important distinction.
And he occasionally uses this phrase, God or understanding, nous, suggesting this close relationship between the two.
So the divine is linked to this pure intellect, this nous.
For Aristotle, the primary activity of God is no thinking itself, contemplating its own perfect being.
So God is essentially engaged in this eternal self-contemplation.
And this makes godlike contemplative activity the highest, the most fulfilling activity for human beings as well.
So our highest calling is to emulate this divine contemplation.
Mm.
And how does this relate to his virtue ethics?
His virtue ethics, with its emphasis on cultivating character through reason and finding the mean between extremes.
Right, the golden mean.
It operates within these implicit theological premises, with the divine serving as a kind of aspirational ideal. That attractive magnet described by Plato.
Right. So it's not just about conforming to social norms. It's about striving towards this divine standard.
And it's worth noting that there remains a certain tension within Aristotle's thought.
Okay, what kind of tension?
The tension regarding that precise relationship between the life of pure contemplation and the cultivation of those other virtues within that practical realm of everyday life.
So how do we balance the contemplative life with the active life? Interesting. And now what about those philosophical schools that emerged in the Hellenistic period? The Epicureans, the Stoics.
Right.
They often present themselves as offering those more self-sufficient ethical systems, seemingly less reliant on those traditional religious frameworks.
Right. They emphasized individual agency and self-mastery in a way that seemed to depart from traditional piety.
But did they truly sever those ties with the divine and morality?
It's a complex picture. While the Epicureans and the Stoics offered ethical frameworks that differed significantly from those of Plato and Aristotle,
Okay.
and indeed from each other,
Yeah.
both schools maintained a nuanced connection, I'd say, between morality and their understanding of the divine.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
The Epicureans, they famously believed that the gods existed in this state of serene detachment, right?
Yeah.
Utterly unconcerned with those affairs of the mortal realm.
So kind of like cosmic observers.
Perhaps even observing our struggles with a degree of amusement, some might say.
Oh, wow.
But they still presented these tranquil deities as models of undisturbed happiness,
Okay.
achieved through the cultivation of inner peace and the limitation of desires.
So there's still a kind of a moral exemplar there, even if it's one of detachment.
And by understanding that the gods posed no threat of punishment or reward, they believed humans could alleviate that anxiety, that
Yeah.
fear,
Right.
and strive for a similar state of ataraxia, that tranquility,
Yeah.
that freedom from disturbance.
Okay, ataraxia, I like that. What about the Stoics?
The Stoics, they conceived a divine reason, logos, as immanent throughout the cosmos, the very principle of order and rationality governing all of existence.
Okay, so a more imminent conception of the divine.
Yes. And the ideal life for the Stoic sage was one lived in complete accordance with this divine reason,
So aligning oneself with the cosmic order.
emphasizing virtue, duty, and a state of detached acceptance, apatheia,
Okay, apatheia, right.
towards whatever fate brings.
Interesting. So even as philosophy was, evolving in ancient Greece, this relationship with the divine in its various forms remained this significant touchstone for understanding morality.
Right. It was woven into the fabric of their ethical reflections.
Now, let's make a significant shift, shall we, and explore the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Here, I think we encounter a very different framework for understanding this connection between religion and morality, wouldn't you say?
A profound shift in emphasis, yes.
Because here, that central organizing principle linking morality and religion, it undergoes this really profound transformation, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, the dominant category, it shifts from, notions of inherent goodness, cosmic order, to the concept of God's direct command.
Right. We move from the realm of philosophical contemplation to the realm of divine decree.
And think about that model of an ancient Near Eastern sovereign. I mean, his authority is expressed through divine decree. He's expected to provide those life-sustaining laws, to care for his chosen people.
Right. And we see this dynamic play out vividly in the creation narrative of Genesis.
Right. God speaks and the world comes into being.
Let there be light,
Right.
and so on.
Right.
And those subsequent commands to be fruitful and multiply, the prohibition regarding that tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Right. That fateful tree.
They established this framework of divinely ordained rules from the very outset of human history.
Okay, so it's a top-down morality, in a sense.
In a way, yes.
God commands and humans are expected to obey.
And disobedience to these commands, it's characterized as a fall into sin.
Right, that idea of sin as a kind of primordial disobedience.
Introducing this concept of a fundamental orientation of the will, either towards or away from God.
So it's not just about actions, it's about the inner disposition of the heart.
And this notion of will as a primary moral faculty, that was largely absent in classical Greek thought.
Right, they were more focused on reason and the cultivation of virtue.
Here, the will takes center stage.
Okay. And the idea of the covenant, that becomes absolutely crucial in this tradition, right?
It's a foundational concept.
Because within the framework of the covenant, obedience to God's specific commands, it's directly linked to the reception of those, divine blessings.
Right. It's a reciprocal arrangement, but one based on obedience.
And we see this dynamic unfold in the covenant established with Abraham.
Abraham, yes.
Marked by that command to leave his homeland.
And the agonizing test of, of the near sacrifice of Isaac.
Right, that's a tough one.
And then, of course, you have that defining event of the liberation from slavery in Egypt
Okay.
under the leadership of Moses, culminating in the giving of the Ten Commandments.
Right, at Mount Sinai.
A foundational set of obligations.
Okay. And these commandments, they're directed not only towards God, but also towards one's fellow human beings, right?
Right. It establishes both religious and social duties.
And here, that concept of the kingdom of God begins to take shape.
Yeah.
It's understood as this sphere of influence, both present and future, where God's divine laws prevail.
Right. It's a very different notion of kingdom than anything envisioned by the Greeks.
Oh, absolutely.
Deeply rooted in this idea of divine legislative authority.
Okay. And the scope of these divine commands, were they intended solely for the people of Israel, or do they have this broader application?
That's an interesting question.
Right.
While those Ten Commandments are given, within that specific context of the covenant established with the Israelites at Mount Sinai,
Right.
there are indications within the Hebrew Bible of a broader moral scope.
Okay, like what?
Think about the covenant established with Noah.
Okay, after the flood.
Exactly. That's explicitly universal in its application, extending to all of humanity.
Okay, so there's a sense of universal moral principles at play.
In the wisdom literature, books like Proverbs,
Right.
they consistently link prescriptions for righteous living with the created nature of human beings.
So it's not just about following arbitrary rules, it's about living in accordance with our inherent nature.
And later Jewish tradition even codified a set of 7 Noahide laws as these universal moral prescriptions given to humanity, prior to that covenant with Abraham.
Fascinating. So there's this layered understanding of moral law with both particular and universal dimensions.
A rich tapestry of ethical thought.
Now, the New Testament emerges, of course, from this Jewish context. How does it build upon and potentially transform this theme of God's commands?
Well, Jesus, in his teachings, he directly engages with and reinterprets that Mosaic law.
Right.
He famously summarizes the entirety of the law and the prophets out swatching.